Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning everybody, my name is Madhvita and I am from Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. Today we will speak on Cold War. The Second World War resulted in enormous destruction of both material and human resources, which we have seen in our last lecture. Russia, France, Germany and Italy were heavily damaged. The Allied powers felt an immediate necessity to attend to the problem of the economic rehabilitation of Europe. The program of economic rehabilitation was initiated through the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. On 12th March 1947, US President Truman gave a speech which came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. We will speak in length about it future. In June 1947, the Marshall Plan was also developed. The US ambition behind these policies was to stop the expansion of communism in Europe and later on in other parts of the world under the patronage of Socialist Russia. The Truman Doctrine has been taken to mark the beginning of the Cold War, at which point the world became divided in two rival camps hostile to each other. The US and the USSR emerged as the two most powerful nations of the world after the Second World War. The United States emerged from the war in excellent shape. It had the largest navy and air force in the world, and it maintained army units in Europe and in Africa. By making atom bombs, it displayed its technological prowess and became the only country to possess such bombs. The Soviet Union had made impressive contribution to the defeat of Hitler and his allies. Though its power base was not comparable to that of the United States, the growing conviction that it represented an ideology of social justice as also of true all-round progress accorded it a very special place in world history. After the Second World War, these two superpowers emerged as leaders of two power blocks. One bloc, led by the United States of America, was referred to as the American bloc or Western bloc, or very self-complimentarily as the Democratic bloc. The communists dubbed it the capitalist bloc. The other bloc was led by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and became known as the Eastern Bloc or Soviet Bloc or Socialist Bloc. Its rivals called it the Communist Bloc or Totalitarian Bloc. The main basis of the contradiction between the two powers were that the US was suspicious about the Soviet Union's aims, while the Soviet Union was suspicious about US policies. This tension between the powers, which although did not lead to any actual war, was called the Cold War, and it was characterized by continued hostility and efforts to weaken or undermine the enemy by every means other than direct military conflict. It was a power struggle that developed between these two superpowers because to each other seemed to possess hegemonic ambitions and was therefore perceived as a threat. It was a period of intense fear and hostility. Eric Hobsbawm comments that it was a new technique of warfare. he goes to the extent of saying that it can reasonably be regarded as a third world war. Though a very peculiar one, it is interesting that there was no obvious reason for antagonism between these two superpowers. But the Cold War era is not a saga of relations between the United States and Soviet Union alone. It also involves a study of the price different regions of the world had to pay in human and material terms, as also of the psychological trauma it imposed on 2 generations at least. Now, we will talk about the debates on the Cold War. The debate has been carried on by scholars in the United States and other countries in the West, because only Western archives and sources were available. Hence, the American perspective dominated the discussion on Cold War. Access to Soviet documents was denied, and because of the state control, Soviet scholars tended to stick to the official version. Therefore, only half the story was told. Soviet writers did not doubt that capitalism and imperialism were responsible for the Cold War. All aspects of the debate centered basically on one question: who was responsible? Historian and political scientists in the West who wrote up to the mid-1960s placed the responsibility for antagonism on the Soviet Union and its ideology of world revolution. They became known as traditionalists or orthodox. They argued that after 1945, the US policy was largely passive and the United States demobilized its armed forces on a massive scale. A different view began to emerge in the 1970s because of the Vietnam fiasco. From this time, the American scholars did not hold the Soviet Union solely responsible for the Cold War and began to point to a range of policies that had alienated the Soviet Union since 1945. Some even argued that it was America's inflexibility and aggressive intent that aroused Soviet fears. These scholars were described as revisionists. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, historians contextualize the action of both countries and stress mutually accountability. When did the Cold War begin? This is the second question related to this debate of Cold War. Some historians date the origin of the Cold War back to the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the Bolshevik regime was established in Russia. In fact, the clash between the ideologies that the Soviet Union and the United States represented can be traced to 1917 and 18, when Lenin and Woodrow Wilson outlined mutually hostile ideological visions. Differences between them widened during 1945 to 47, when the post-war territorial settlement was worked out. Some experts date the Cold War from the adoption of a hard ideological line by Stalin in February 1946 and still others from the Truman Doctrine of 1947. In a speech in February 1946, the report of which was circulated widely, Stalin said communism and capitalism could never live peacefully together and that wars were inevitable until communism ultimately triumphed. In 1946, Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, gave a speech at the University of the US in which he stated that from the Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This notion of iron curtain referred to the Soviet Union European countries and has since become the repressive image of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. For 45 years, the two superpowers became regimes of global interventions and tried to guide, decide, and control the destinies of all nations. Let's talk about the causes of Cold War. As a result of power politics as usual, they argue that the powers have always distrusted each other and what each does for its own security appears threatening to its neighbors. American scholars have been arguing that after the Second World War, the United States had begun to disengage from Europe and was obliged to take up much more active role in 1947 because the West European countries insisted upon security commitments to contain Russia's expansion. After the success of communists in China in 1949, the United States was obliged to entangle itself in East Asia. The Soviet Union and the United States had conflicting views on how to organize society's economies and political system. The Americans believed that theirs was a uniquely superior society that represented principles such as liberty, democracy, free enterprise, peace, and cooperation between nations. In their own opinion, they had a special mission to spread these values in the interest of the entire world. The Soviet Union held that communism represented people's democracy and ideology of the deprived and downtrodden, and was superior to the bourgeois version of democracy. It held that Western democracies were agencies of capitalism, which was by definition aggressive. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were impelled by an urge to dominate world politics. In 1946, Milotov, the finance minister of Soviet Union, stated, "The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic is now one of the mightiest countries of the world." Soviet Union did not confine itself to establish communist rule in the East European countries, but also became involved in East Asia, Cuba, and Africa. With time, the nuclear race reached undreamed of heights. The status of two superpowers became linked with the possession and threatened use of nuclear weapons, in other words, with the capacity to destroy. In the process, the number of nuclear weapons continued to multiply. By the end of 1955, both sides had fully functional thermonuclear bombs as well as long-ranged bombers from which to drop these bombs. Moreover, the two superpowers did not rule out the possibility using the nuclear weapons. Germany became another source of contention between the Soviet Union and the Western Alliance. Although initially Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, she later became divided into 2 zones. The 3 zones under the US, Britain and France became one, forming West Germany, and the Soviet zone became East Germany. In West Germany, with considerable US aid, rapid development took place along capitalist lines. The German communists, who had been banished by the fascist regimes and their allies during the war, were encouraged in East Germany. In West Germany, various political parties hostile to communism were encouraged. In this way, by 1947, Germany became divided and later two independent states were formed out of one Germany. In Greece, the communists united to attempt to overthrow the fascist occupants. Subsequently, the communists became engaged in a civil war against the monarchical military regime in Greece. There were 10,000 British troops in Greece who were trying to restore the rule of monarchy by driving out the communists, but in 1947, due to increasing burden of supporting the Greek government in civil war, Britain decided to withdraw. It was at this juncture that the US decided to intervene in the Greek civil war in order to prevent a communist seizure of political power there. Thus, according to most of the historians, the era of Cold War began. The Truman Doctrine of March 1947. The communist guerrillas in Greece received help from Albania, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia during the civil war and thus were growing there. In Turkey too, the communists were gaining strength. In the case of Greece, the British appealed to the US for aid, while the Turkish government appealed to the US for assistance against the communists. The US President Truman addressed a joint session of the US Congress on 12th March 1947 with a speech that later came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. In essence, the Truman Doctrine was a statement of belief which later assumed that form a policy. The policy of the US government was to intervene militarily and economically in the civil wars against the communists. Due to US aid, the communists in Greece were defeated by 1949. The same thing happened in the case of Turkey also. The Truman Doctrine initiated the phase of the US policy of containment of communism across the world. The Marshall Plan was an economic extension of the Truman Doctrine. The American Secretary of State, George Marshall, planned the European Recovery Program. At that time, the communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy and in other parts of Europe as well. The US administration thought that with economic aid, Western Europe would become prosperous and this would prevent the communists from gaining strength in Europe. In the next 4 years from 1947 onwards, a sum of over $13,000 million entered Europe in the form of Marshall aid. The Soviet Union felt that Marshall aid was fundamentally aimed at countering the spread of communism. Asia's foreign minister termed the Marshall Plan dollar imperialism. It further worsened the relations between Russia and the US. The Soviet Union also criticized the Marshall Plan because it undermined the importance of the United Nations. Spread of nationalism and unrest in the subject countries also worsened the relationship between the two superpowers. Due to the rising tide of anti-colonial movements, British, Dutch, French and Portuguese colonial rule ended in many countries. During the 1940s, anti-colonial political ideology was spreading fast in colonies like India, Burma, Sri Lanka, Indonesia and Indochina. At that time, public opinion in Europe was also not in favor of colonial empires. Socialist states and the communists were against colonial rule, but equally again USA was against the reimposing of colonial rule in the former colonies. Simultaneously, anti-colonial movements were spreading fast in the colonies. When the Japanese realized that they were facing defeat, they started to encourage the nationalist movements in these colonies to destabilize their enemies. They encouraged the nationalists in Indonesia, Indochina and India, and even supplied weapons to the Indonesian nationalists. The spread of nationalism and the growing financial and administrative inability of the former colonial powers to rule the colonies directly ultimately resulted in the birth of independent states in these countries. Consolidation of socialist forces in Europe and Southeast Asia. The end of the Second World War also witnessed the development and growth of socialistic forces in different parts of the world. In the Western European countries, when parliamentary democracy prevailed, communist and various socialist parties started to appear. In 1945, the Chinese communists were waging a bitter struggle for the seizure of the political power, and with Japanese withdrawal, the Chinese communists entered into a prolonged battle with the Kuomintang forces led by Chiang Kai-shek. After a protectorate civil war with the Kuomintang, the Chinese communists won the battle under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. But rather than recognizing the strength of the Chinese nationalism, the American government classified the Beijing regime as being masculine only. This was the root cause of the troubled relationship between the People's Republic of China and the United States. Mao traveled to Moscow and in February 1950 signed a treaty of friendship, alliance and mutual assistance with USSR. The two communists had joined hands and a solid communist bloc seemed to have emerged. With these developments, the nature of the Cold War confrontation changed. So far, it had focused on Europe, but with these developments, it arrived in Asia. A period of proxy wars began. The nationalist movement of Vietnam took off under the leadership of the communists. The Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh established the Republic of Vietnam in 1946. The Viet Minh were not ready to surrender their independence to France, and in North Vietnam they established themselves firmly. The Vietnamese communists were receiving help from China, but America started to help France, and so in South Vietnam the war continued until May 1954. Under the Geneva Convention of 1954, Vietnam was partitioned, and so North Vietnam remained under communist control. They eventually captured South Vietnam in 1975. From these important revolutionary movements, communist parties started to gain strength in Sri Lanka, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, etc., and various popular movements were launched there. In 1950, the focus shifted suddenly to Korea. The first hot war of the Cold War period was fought in Korea from 1950 to 1953. Geographically, it remained confined to this country, but not only did the United States, China and the Soviet Union became involved in this war. Soldiers of 20 different countries from all 6 continents too fought in the war. Ultimately, the struggle ended in a draw. The Cold War has ended, but at the beginning of the 21st century, Korea remains divided. Let's talk about it in a detail. On 25th June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and within a week, the North Korean army virtually overran the whole peninsula. Both sides took extreme positions. The United States held that Stalin was bent upon spreading communism. It is clear that the timing of attack and war strategy was decided by Kim himself, and that initially Soviet or Chinese troops were not involved in their politics. The US was worried that a success for communist forces would adversely affect its prestige in impoverished Japan, where a powerful communist party was using the rhetoric of revolution and acted immediately. On 25th June itself, it put a resolution before the Security Council of the United Nations calling for the withdrawal of the army from South Korea. The resolution was passed by 9 votes to nil. The Security Council also asked all members to send troops to repel the North Korean invasion. The war dragged on. By the end of September, American troops crossed the border and moved northwards, occupying the capital Pyongyang, and then reached the Chinese border on the Yalu River. China communicated via India repeated warnings that it was determined to halt the advances of the United Nations forces if these proceeded beyond the 38th parallel. Mao was determined not to have the American on Yalu River. He sent thousands of army men to push US Army southwards. In July 1951, negotiation for an armistice began. An armistice was finally signed on 27th July 1953. It provided for a ceasefire along the lines held by the opposing armies on that date. Era of Nikita Khrushchev. After the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the key player. His policy was a mixture of seeking peaceful coexistence with the West while continuing a policy of confrontation. The period following 1953 is described as a period of thaw in international relations. In 1953, an agreement was signed on the Korean issue. In 1955, a treaty was signed creating a united and neutral Austria. All occupying troops were withdrawn. The Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Finland and Manchuria and also established diplomatic relations with Yugoslavia. In the summer of 1955, a summit was held at Geneva, which was attended by Britain, France, the United States and the Soviet Union. Nikolai Bulganin, the Soviet premier during 1955 to 58, also had a high hopes that India was developing towards socialism, and in 1955 he visited India to build stronger ties. At the same time, the Soviet Union made it clear that it had no intention of relaxing its control in East Europe. He also talked of peaceful coexistence and of the possibility of other being different roads to socialism. An era of internal reform seemed to attend it in with the release of many prisoners and restoration of the reputation of others. But when hopes of relaxation of control from Moscow led to demands for change in Poland and Hungary, Moscow made it very clear that it did not have any intention of relaxing its grip on states within the Warsaw Pact. Meanwhile, the arms races heated up. The late 1950s saw an intense period of competition in nuclear weapons. Khrushchev believed that the Soviet Union was catching up with the United States in missile technology. By 1960, the world became a global battlefield in which both superpowers could strike at each other's territory from their own in 30-40 minutes only, because this was the time taken by a ballistic missile to travel from one continent to other. In 1961, Soviet Union impressed the whole world by putting the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space. All this increased the confidence of the Russians. As ideological conformity was imposed on either side, a generation grew up under the shadow of mutually assured destruction. Crisis in Cuba. In 1960, another small state, Cuba, decided to adopt a nationalist path for growth. When this was not allowed by the United States, it turned to communism. The attempt caused one of the most written about confrontations of the Cold War, the Cuban crisis, which brought the world closer to a nuclear war than ever before or since. Since becoming independent of Spain in 1898 until the 1950s, this island country had been effectively a protectorate of the United States. In the 1950s, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, the Cubans carried on a resistance movement against the America-backed regime of Batista. Castro came to power in 1959. To strengthen the country's economy and improve the condition of the people, his government took over agricultural land and nationalized banks and businesses. This adversely affected American companies as well as associated American citizens who had controlling interest in Cuba. In May 1960, Castro established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. The United States government immediately concluded that Cuba had become communist in all but name. The American government under John F. Kennedy not only imposed economic sanctions against Cuba but decided to overthrow Castro. The American government presumed that the local people would support them and there would be a general uprising against Castro, but this did not happen. The Cubans did not support them and the small Cuban Air Force and Army outgunned and overpowered the US Army. The whole episode resulted in humiliation for the United States. Thereafter, Castro took to courting the Soviet government. As Castro shifted to the Soviet camp, the United States government made a series of attempts to eliminate Castro by poisoning his cigars and by spoiling Cuba's sugar crop. The Cuban government apprehended that the United States intended to take military action against Cuba. Moscow decided to help Cuba. Khrushchev believed that imperialism could be defeated by revolution in the Third World. Castro's success in Cuba seemed to confirm this belief. He also felt that though the communist ideology had great appeal in the Third World communist states, were not emerging. The United States had placed missiles MRBMs and IRBMs in Britain, Italy and Turkey, obviously against the Soviet Union. It has been argued that these missiles were of questionable accuracy and little military value. Their purpose was to extend assurance to the countries hosting them and to unsettle the country at which they were aimed. Khrushchev had made it clear that he regarded the placement of missiles in Europe as a personal affront or even a threat. After the Bay of Pigs incident, he warned the United States that Turkey and Iran were at least as threatening to the Soviet Union as Cuba was to the United States. Castro was at first skeptical of the Soviet decision to place the missiles in Cuba. He feared that this might turn the country into a Soviet military base. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union installed weapons in secrecy in Cuba. Castro was opposed to secrecy on the ground that Cuba was not ashamed of accepting Soviet missiles. The deployment of MRBMs, IRBMs, MiG-21 bombers, fighter interceptors and some 42,000 Soviet troops about 150 kilometers from the American heartland, and that too secretly, was a remarkable logistic feat. On 15th October, however, the United States spy planes spotted these missile sites. Their stationing as well as secrecy of operations, it shook the Americans. Kennedy's administration chose to quarantine Cuba by erecting a naval blockade 800 miles from the eastern tip of Cuba to prevent further shipment of aggressive weapons to Cuba. On the morning of 24th October, many Soviet vessels were heading towards Cuba. Washington reduced the distance to 500 miles to give the Soviet Union another day. People across the world were watching this on TV sets. There was extreme tension when on 27th October an American U-2 plane was shot down by either Cuban or Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Cuba publicly took responsibility for this incident. The world seemed to be moving towards a nuclear war. Ultimately, the Soviets chose to avoid war. On 27th October, Khrushchev announced over the radio that the Soviet Union was prepared to remove the missiles from the Cuba if the United States undertook not to invade Cuba and also to remove its own missiles from Turkey. Kennedy also replied publicly. He offered that if the Soviet Union were to remove the missiles from Cuba, the United States would not invade Cuba and withdraw the quarantine measures promptly. In private, the Soviet ambassador to the United States was assured that the United States would remove missiles from Turkey later. With this, the worst phase of crisis came to an end. Crisis in Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was facing deep political crisis at home and in the satellite states and an acute economic crisis within the country. All these developments led to the strange and most unexpected death of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Externally, for the Soviet Union, involvement in Afghanistan was becoming expensive and embarrassing. Its army was making little progress. People soon began to describe Afghanistan as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In the 1980s, the United States decided to confront the Soviet Union throughout Africa. In the East European countries, too, opposition to the Soviet hegemony was growing. in Poland. In 1980, there were protests and strikes in the cities, and a new organization of trade union Solidarity was established. It was independent of the state and the Communist Party there. The Soviet government saw in this a potential danger to the then existing order in the whole of Eastern Europe and considered military intervention, as was done in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But ultimately, it appointed a new head of the state that arrested the leaders of opposition and brought the political situation under control. Solidarity was dissolved. The Soviet Union faced an economic crisis also. Its record on education, housing, health and other social services were terrible. While in the industrialized countries of the West, life expectancy was increasing, in the Soviet Union it was decreasing. As a result of bureaucratic control, inefficiency, corruption and lack of incentives, consumer goods were always in short supply. Long queues of consumers to procure their share of supplies were a common sight in the country. Salt, soap, milk and meat were all rationed. Though the government invested heavily in agriculture, yet cereals had to be imported. Without private ownership, there was no profit motive and hence there was no incentive to produce more. Collectivization destroyed the emphasis on efficiency to the extent that 60% of vegetables and over 30% of animal products were produced on 3% of privately owned land. At the same time, party bosses and high officials had a lavish lifestyle. The general level of education in Soviet Union was high. The Soviet Union was the first country to send a man to space, but it lagged behind even in the technological field. It could not keep pace in developing computers. By the 1980s, people in the border areas were receiving broadcast from radio and televisions in neighboring countries such as Finland and West Germany that seemed to demonstrate the contrast in lifestyle under communism and the free market economy. They realized that their lives were drab and circumscribed and become more aware of the gap between what they were asked to believe and their actual condition. This produced simmering social discontent. Gorbachev adopted new policies with the aim of saving communism by revitalizing and modernizing it. He has become known for inaugurating the twin new programs of Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost meant openness in the conduct of public affairs and in the expression of opinion. The idea was to foster better understanding of government, Soviet history and contemporary society. Perestroika stood for restructuring of the Soviet system by introducing decentralization, limit on control by bureaucracy and some market forces to stimulate the economy. The resulting change took three directions. Firstly, these stimulated separatist oppositional movements in the satellite states of the Soviet Union. Secondly, these unleashed democratic and nationalist forces within the Soviet Union, which led ultimately to the disintegration of the Union. Thirdly, these led to aggravation of economic crisis because the government hesitated between adopting free market policies and control by the state. He took path-breaking initiatives to reduce the expenditure on armaments for which it was necessary to negotiate with the United States. Alongside using confucianist language, they tried to persuade the Soviet leadership of the opportunity to negotiate with the US. As early as November 1985, the first Soviet-American summit was held at Geneva. In February 1986, at the 27th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he took the opportunity to redefine the concept of peaceful coexistence. Gorbachev interpreted peaceful coexistence as an end in itself, as a part of genuine cooperation with Western countries, especially with US. This change was accepted at this Congress. It was not just redefinition of a doctrinal point, but marked a fundamental transformation in the basis of Soviet foreign policy. In February 1989, Russia withdrew from Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, however, civil war continued and Najibullah's government was suspended for 3 years. In Eastern Europe, Gorbachev's new program of glasnost and perestroika, by enabling people to voice their hopes and expectations openly, became a substance of change. The chance of free discussions fanned oppositional movements, and campaigns for liberation engulfed all the East European countries. In a remarkably peaceful manner, satellite state of the Soviet Union became independent, with glasnost and perestroika as freedom of expression became a reality. Opposition from long-time non-conformist began to surface in the East European countries. In Poland, Solidarity, which had been legally dissolved in 1981, had continued its activities underground. It became active in 1988 and organized huge anti-government demonstrations. In April 1989, the Polish government lifted the ban on this body, granted legal recognition to the Catholic Church, and agreed to allow elections. In this election, candidates supported by Solidarity and also the Roman Catholic Church won all the 161 seats. In 1990, communist rule ended in Poland and a democratic state was established. Hungary too saw peaceful transition from communism to a parliamentary system of government. In May 1989, the Hungarian government opened the border with Austria by removing the pointed wire, the symbol of the Iron Curtain. In June, the Communist Party admitted that in 1956, the trial and execution of leaders was illegal. Similar protest movements surfaced in Bulgaria, Romania, and even Czechoslovakia, which was the most economically advanced country of East Europe. Disintegration of the United of Soviet Socialist Republic. It seems Gorbachev believed that he could allow the East European countries to go their way and still maintain the Soviet Union of Socialist Republics. Like many officials and intellectuals, he continued to believe that in a liberalized system also Communist Party would continue to control the political life in the Soviet Union. At Moscow, he had to face crossfire of criticism from both those who felt that he had gone too far and those others who felt that he had not gone far enough. Yeltsin held that Russia should opt for a Western-style market economy as soon as possible. Despite economic reforms, downward thrust of economy had continued. The year 1989 saw a strike by miners which began in Siberia and spread to Kazakhstan and then up to Ukraine in the west. One issue that created resentment was non-availability of soap to wash. This was the first major strike since 1917. In a few months, situation was brought under control. On 17th March, a referendum was held on the issue of preservation of Soviet Union. The very holding of this referendum was a symbol of uncertainty and weakness, as many as 6 republics had refused to take part in the referendum. On 12th June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected as President of the Russian Republic. 8 conservative leaders of the Communist Party, including who had some ministers been handpicked by Gorbachev, declared that Gorbachev had become very ill and that to save the country from disintegration, they had concentrated all power in their own hands. Yeltsin dramatically mounted a rank outside the Russian parliament building to urge citizens of Moscow to resist the revolution. Meanwhile, Gorbachev had refused to sign the papers. This attempt to grab power thus failed. On 23rd August, Yeltsin announced the suspension of all activities of the Russian Communist Party whose leaders had organized the revolution. The next day, Gorbachev resigned as Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which had been the most powerful position in the Soviet Union. He continued as President of the Soviet Union. Even when the outcome of the revolution was not clear, Estonia and Latvia declared themselves independent. Subsequently, several other states did so. A last-minute attempt was made to establish a commonwealth, but meanwhile, on the Christmas Day of 1991, Gorbachev resigned from the post of President of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin moved in as the President of Russia. The red flag was lowered and a new Russian tricolor with white, blue and red horizontal stripes was hoisted in its state. Russia was treated as the natural successor to the dead USSR in the United Nations and elsewhere. All 15 constituent states of the United Soviet Union formed independent governments. End of the Cold War. The Cold War came to an end when one of the superpowers, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, disintegrated. This was the result of conjunction of underlying causes and surface events. American scholars argued that the USSR collapsed due to proclamation of military power by the US during this period. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic and multicultural state which maintained itself by regimenting social, cultural and political life of people. The USSR and with thus the Bolshevik Revolution died. Rulers in Russia created a monolithic state machine which represented the denial of Marx's humanist vision. Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat turned out to be dictatorship of a new class. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the idea of dealing with the limitations of capitalism through political revolution and social engineering has almost disappeared. Today, reformist socialists believe that irrationalities of capitalism can be tamed by giving the state a partial role in economic life. They believe that sectors such as transport, commerce, electricity and iron and steel, which form the commanding heights of economy, should be under state control. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic disappeared from the map without war. The Cold War came to an end. When this war started, there was no declaration of war. The two principal antagonists never became engaged in direct military conflict. The collapse of the communist regime destroyed the international system that had determined international relations for over 40 years. Sometimes the period of the Cold War is described as an era of long peace or a period of peaceful international system. This was the period, as another historian puts it, when war was improbable and peace was impossible. Let's stop here. Thank you very much.